Switzerland, the land of peace, the land of neutrality, the land where the world's most powerful nations come when they want to end wars. Lake Lucerne, snow-capped mountains, the Burgenstock resort sitting high above the clouds like a fortress of diplomacy. And on June 21st, 2026, the fate of the entire Middle East was supposed to be decided right there. The American vice president had flown in, the Iranian foreign minister had flown in, Pakistan's prime minister was in the building, Qatar's top diplomat was at the table, the world's media was watching every door, every handshake, every expression, and then Iran walked out. Not a quiet exit, not a diplomatic excuse, a message, a statement, a warning to Washington that no matter how many memorandums you sign, no matter how many cameras you bring, Iran will not be your show. But here is where it gets complicated. Because even as Iranian state media declared the talks suspended, sources inside the building told a completely different story. So what actually happened in Switzerland on June 21st? Who blinked first? Who is telling the truth? And what does this moment mean for a Middle East that is hanging by a single thread above a second catastrophe? Stay with me, because I have spent 30 years studying geopolitics and power, and this is the full picture. To understand what happened on June 21st, you have to understand the road that led there, because this was not simply a meeting. This was the culmination of months of war, destruction, failed negotiations, broken ceasefires, and last-minute diplomatic rescues. Cast your mind back to February 28, 2026. American and Israeli forces launched a massive coordinated military operation against Iran. The strikes targeted nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and senior leadership. The supreme leader of Iran was killed. A successor was rapidly appointed. The region went into shock. Iran responded by doing what it had long threatened. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway through which approximately 1/5 of the world's oil and gas passes every single day was shut. Global energy markets exploded. Economies from Tokyo to London felt the pressure within hours. Weeks of bombardment, weeks of counterstrikes, weeks of Iranian missile launches against American bases across the region. The world watched as the most volatile flashpoint on Earth burned hotter than it had in decades. Then, a ceasefire. April 8th, 2 weeks, fragile, contested, but a ceasefire nonetheless. Negotiations followed in Islamabad, Pakistan. 21 hours of direct face-to-face talks. The highest level engagement between Washington and Tehran since 1979. And yet, they collapsed. The nuclear question proved impossible. The American side demanded zero enrichment. The Iranian side declared enrichment a non-negotiable right. The talks ended without a deal. The American Navy announced a blockade of Iranian ports. The situation deteriorated once again, but the world could not afford a full resumption of hostilities. And so, in the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt worked behind the scenes. Messages passed through mediators. Proposals went back and forth. A memorandum of understanding, a framework for peace, began to take shape. On June 17, 2026, the American head of state and the Iranian president electronically signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding, a document that committed both sides to a 60-day negotiation period, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, a halt to hostilities, and a framework for addressing the nuclear question. The world exhaled, briefly, because the ink was barely dry when the complications began. Israel, which was not a party to the memorandum, continued its military operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Iran declared these strikes a violation of the spirit of the agreement. Tensions immediately re-escalated, and the technical talks scheduled for Switzerland on Friday, June 19th, were postponed. When the meeting was eventually confirmed for Sunday, June 21st, the atmosphere was already charged. The Burgenstock resort had been chosen carefully. It sits above Lake Lucerne like a palace above the clouds. Neutral ground, Swiss neutrality, the same venue that hosted the Ukraine Peace Summit 2 years earlier. A place designed to give diplomacy its best possible chance. But diplomacy, as June 21st would prove, is never just about the venue. The delegations began arriving before dawn. The American team, led by the vice president, accompanied by the senior White House envoy and the presidential son-in-law, touched down at Emmen Air Base in Switzerland just before midnight. By early morning, they were at Burgenstock. The Iranian delegation arrived overnight. The foreign minister, a veteran of the 2015 nuclear negotiations, and the parliament speaker, who had been Iran's chief negotiator throughout the peace process, both entered the Burgenstock resort quietly. Iranian state media confirmed their arrival. The parliament speaker standing in front of the Iranian flag, his expression unreadable. The Qatari prime minister and foreign minister was already in Switzerland. Qatar's role had been central to this entire process. It was Qatari mediation, alongside Pakistan, that had brought both sides back from the brink multiple times. The Burgenstock resort itself is owned by Qatar Hospitality, part of Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. The symbolism was intentional. Pakistan's prime minister and the army chief had arrived in Zurich with their delegations. The world's cameras were positioned at every entrance. Every arrival was photographed. Every handshake, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized. And then came the moment that set the tone for everything that followed. The opening session, the quadrilateral meeting, all four parties, America, Iran, Pakistan, Qatar, in the same room. American and Pakistani officials stepped forward for the cameras. The Qatari prime minister stood alongside them. Statements were made. The vice president spoke warmly about the historic nature of the moment. And the Iranian foreign minister, he briefly entered the room. The cameras caught him. For a single moment, the Iranian foreign minister and the American vice president stood within the same four walls. But the foreign minister did not stand beside the vice president. He did not pose for photographs. He did not speak to the press. Iranian sources told reporters that Tehran had refused to enter the meeting at all until journalists were removed from the room. They called the American setup a media show, a performance designed for domestic consumption back in Washington, a photo opportunity that Iran was not willing to provide. Iran had made this calculation before. In Islamabad in April, the same dynamic played out. The Iranian foreign minister was present but invisible to the cameras. Tehran's position was clear. We are here to negotiate, not to legitimize your narrative. The cameras were eventually cleared. The formal session began. 80 minutes. That is how long the first round of talks lasted. 80 minutes after months of war, after thousands of casualties, after the global economy was disrupted by a closed strait and a naval blockade. 80 minutes of formal discussion. And then both delegations withdrew for internal consultations. While the delegations were consulting internally, the story broke. Iranian state media outlets, two separate semi-official news agencies closely aligned with Tehran's government, announced that the Iranian negotiating team had walked out of the Switzerland talks entirely. The reason given? A post on the American head of state's social media platform, posted while negotiations were still underway. The message threatened to resume military strikes against Iran if the Strait of Hormuz was not immediately reopened. The exact words were, "We will hit Iran very hard again, just like we did last week, only harder." The Iranian parliament speaker, sitting in Burgenstock, responded within minutes, a direct message on social media. The words were deliberate and calm. "We do not take American threats seriously." Iranian media reported the walkout as a protest, a principled refusal to negotiate under military threats. Tehran's position, they said, was consistent. You cannot bomb us and talk to us simultaneously. You cannot threaten strikes from your social media while your diplomats sit at our table. Choose one. And yet, a major international wire service reported something different entirely. Sources inside the building, granted anonymity because of the sensitivity of the situation, said that Iranian negotiators had not actually left Switzerland, that despite the media reports, the delegations were still engaged, that talks were continuing in some form. A stunning contradiction. On one hand, official Iranian state media declaring a walkout. On the other hand, sources with direct knowledge saying nothing of the sort had happened. So which version was true? In my 30 years of studying how power actually operates in international affairs, I have seen this pattern many times. And the answer is probably both. Here is what the available evidence suggests. The formal quadrilateral session concluded after 80 minutes. Both sides withdrew for internal consultations. During this period, the social media threat was posted. Iranian state media, which sometimes operates ahead of official positions and sometimes reflects the position of hardliners within the system, declared a walkout. This gave Tehran maximum negotiating leverage. It communicated anger and defiance to its domestic audience. But back channels, the informal conversations, the mediator-to-mediator communications, the quiet exchanges that happen away from cameras and official statements, those appear to have continued. This is how modern diplomacy works between adversaries, especially between powers with decades of mutual hostility, zero trust, and enormous domestic political pressures on both sides. The walkout was real enough to be a message, but the talks were alive enough to continue, and that ambiguity, that deliberate gray zone, was itself a negotiating strategy. To understand the walkout, you must understand what Iran's delegation came to Switzerland to achieve. They were not there to sign another agreement. The memorandum of understanding had already been signed on June 17th. The documents were in place. They came with a single, overriding demand: implementation. The memorandum contained 14 points. Iran's chief negotiator told reporters before departing Tehran that his delegation was going to Switzerland primarily to remind the Americans that the first obligation was implementation of what had already been agreed, not new discussions, not new frameworks, implementation. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson spelled it out publicly before the talks began. The termination of the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, would be the main topic of discussions. Not nuclear enrichment levels, not uranium stockpiles, not the technical details of sanctions relief. Lebanon. Because from Tehran's perspective, the memorandum was meaningless if Israeli military operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon were continuing. The MOU had called for a halt to hostilities on all fronts. Lebanon was a front. Israeli strikes against Lebanese targets were therefore, in Iranian eyes, a direct violation of what had been agreed. The Iranian spokesperson cited Clause 13 of the memorandum specifically. That clause made the launch of nuclear negotiations contingent on the implementation of 5 foundational clauses, the first of which was the cessation of war on all fronts. Tehran's logic was airtight from a legal reading of the document. Washington's logic was equally airtight from a practical reading of the situation. The American side maintained that Israel was not a party to the memorandum. The agreement was between Washington and Tehran. Israeli operations in Lebanon could not be attributed to American violations. The vice president told reporters before the session that, in his view, the Strait of Hormuz reopening and the ending of the Iranian nuclear program had already been accomplished. The question before the delegations, he said, was how much more can we accomplish together? 2 delegations, 2 readings of the same document, 2 irreconcilable starting positions. And against that backdrop, an emergency session on Lebanon was added to the very first day of talks. The item that Iran said had to be resolved first, before any nuclear discussions could begin, was placed at the top of the agenda before a single formal negotiation had taken place. That was, in itself, a significant concession to Iran's framing, but it was not enough to prevent the storm that followed. There is one additional element to June 21st that cannot be ignored. According to information that emerged in the days surrounding the Switzerland talks, American forces conducted additional strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities on this very same day. The targets reportedly included the Fordo underground enrichment facility, the Natanz nuclear site, and the Isfahan Nuclear Research Center. Let that sink in. On the same day that American and Iranian diplomats sat across from each other in Switzerland to discuss a framework for peace, American bombers were reportedly targeting Iranian nuclear sites. I want you to think about what this means. In 30 years, I have studied many conflicts, many negotiations, many moments of global crisis, but I have rarely seen a contradiction this stark. Negotiating and bombing simultaneously, extending an olive branch with one hand while continuing military operations with the other. From Washington's perspective, this would be consistent with a strategy of maximum pressure. Keep the military option alive. Keep the other side negotiating from a position of weakness. Demonstrate that the pause in hostilities is conditional and reversible. From Tehran's perspective, this was the ultimate proof of everything they had been saying, that American promises cannot be trusted, that the memorandum was a tactical pause, not a genuine commitment to peace, that the cameras and the handshakes were theater, and the bombs were the real policy. This is why the walkout, or the near walkout, or whatever it actually was, carried so much symbolic weight. Iran needed to demonstrate to its own people and to its regional allies that it would not be humiliated, that it would not sit and smile for cameras while its nuclear sites burned, that there was a line, and Washington had crossed it. We now stand at one of the most consequential inflection points of this entire crisis. The 60-day negotiation window under the Memorandum of Understanding is ticking. The clock started with the signing. Every day that passes without progress brings us closer to either a breakthrough or a breakdown. Based on my analysis of the forces at play, here are the 3 paths forward. The first path is a diplomatic breakthrough. Both sides step back from the brink. The Lebanon issue is addressed, at least partially, through American pressure on the Israeli government to observe a more comprehensive halt to operations against Hezbollah. Iran accepts this as sufficient implementation of the ceasefire clause. Technical talks resume. The nuclear discussions begin in earnest. A framework emerges within the 60-day window that limits Iranian enrichment in exchange for significant sanctions relief and the unfreezing of tens of billions of dollars in Iranian assets. The Strait of Hormuz reopens fully, global energy markets stabilize, a new Middle East order begins to take shape. This scenario requires the most trust between parties that have the least of it. But the economic incentives on both sides are enormous. Iran's economy has been devastated. Its currency, its trade, its energy exports, all strangled. And Washington faces rising domestic pressure over the economic cost of the blockade and the disruption to global supply chains. The incentives for a deal are real. The second path is a managed stalemate. Neither side breaks the ceasefire, but neither side makes meaningful progress on the nuclear question either. The 60 days pass without a comprehensive agreement. A new temporary extension is negotiated. The situation becomes a permanent low-intensity standoff. The Strait of Hormuz partially reopens for commercial shipping, but remains contested. Iranian nuclear sites, already badly damaged, are monitored but not inspected. The nuclear question is effectively frozen in ambiguity. This is the least dramatic outcome and perhaps the most likely in the short term. It is the status quo preserved by mutual exhaustion. The third path is the second collapse. The Lebanon crisis escalates beyond anyone's control. Hezbollah launches a major attack. Israeli forces respond with overwhelming force. Iran declares the memorandum void and closes the Strait of Hormuz once more. Washington resumes its blockade and threatens renewed strikes. The 60-day window collapses before it has a chance to produce anything. The region returns to active conflict with even higher stakes than before because now both sides have tested each other's capabilities and know exactly what the other can do. This scenario becomes more likely with every day that Lebanon remains unresolved. The thread connecting the Iran deal to the Lebanon situation is thin, and it is under enormous pressure. Step back from the drama of the walkout. Step back from the social media threats and the refused photo opportunities, and ask the deeper question. What did June 21st actually reveal about the state of this negotiation? It revealed three things. First, both sides are still in the game. Despite the walkout narrative, despite the threatening posts, despite the contradictions and the chaos, Iranian diplomats were in Switzerland. American diplomats were in Switzerland. They sat, however briefly, in the same room. This matters enormously. In the darkest months of 2026, this would have seemed impossible. The fact that it happened at all is itself a form of progress. Second, the Lebanon variable is the critical wild card. Every analysis of this situation eventually arrives at the same destination. The fate of the entire negotiation is inextricably linked to what happens between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. As long as that conflict continues, Tehran has both a justification to slow walk the nuclear talks and a genuine grievance about American credibility. Washington cannot deliver a comprehensive Middle East peace deal while its closest regional ally continues military operations that one of the parties to the peace deal considers a direct violation of its terms. Third, the trust deficit is almost total. Both sides are negotiating not just with each other, but with their own domestic audiences, their own hardliners, their own political survival calculations. The Iranian parliament speaker posting defiant messages on social media from the negotiating venue is not reckless behavior. It is survival behavior in a system where appearing to capitulate to American pressure is politically fatal. The American threats posted to social media while diplomats are in the room is not accidental behavior. It is calculated pressure designed to demonstrate strength to a domestic audience that has invested enormous political capital in this confrontation. When both sides are simultaneously negotiating and performing, the actual substance of the negotiation becomes almost secondary to the theater around it. That is the fundamental challenge of what happens next. Switzerland was not a failure, but it was not a success either. It was what most major diplomatic moments actually are: a messy, contradictory, uncertain step forward on a road that remains very long and very dangerous. The Iranian foreign minister came, the parliament speaker came, the American vice president came, Pakistan came, Qatar came. They sat in that room above Lake Lucerne, surrounded by snow and tension and the weight of everything that had been destroyed in the months before that moment. And then they walked out, or they did not, or they did, and then came back. The ambiguity itself is the story, because real diplomacy between adversaries who have spent decades in confrontation does not resolve cleanly. It does not produce triumphant handshakes in the first session. It produces 80 minutes of formal talks, followed by hours of internal consultations, followed by contradictory statements, followed by the next round. The question is not what happened on June 21st. The question is what happens next. The 60-day clock is running. Lebanon is burning. Nuclear sites are damaged but not destroyed. Frozen assets worth tens of billions of dollars are sitting in accounts waiting for a signal. And somewhere in the gap between Iranian defiance and American pressure, there may still be a deal. History will record whether June 21st was the day the peace almost died, or the day it finally found its footing. I want to know what you think. Can these two sides actually get to a final deal within the 60-day window, or is this ceasefire on borrowed time? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you believe the world needs to understand what is really happening in the Middle East right now, share this video with one person who needs to see it.